With Sly Cooper's debut being the success that it was, you needn't have been a video game pundit in 2003 to anticipate that a sequel would soon poke its head above the horizon. Estimated sales do place Sly beneath eternally associated PlayStation 2 brethren Ratchet and Jak, yet it was still incontrovertibly a success, artistically and commercially. It wouldn't be outlandish to speculate that this accomplishment would be cause for particular celebration from Sony. During their fledgling years with the original PlayStation, Spyro and Crash had been monster hits for the platform, both of which were the products of, at that point in time, a pair of relatively undistinguished developers, Insomniac and Naughty Dog. While Sony were to lose exclusivity of those Universal-owned franchises in the following console generation, the duo of developers would move on to fresh projects that would reside solely on the PlayStation, which of course were Ratchet and Jak. With Sly, not only had Sony found another promising upstart studio, but they also wholly possessed this hottish new franchise, so there wasn't any risk of Sly Cooper making an appearance on the N-Gage. Production on Sly 2, Band of Thieves, which thankfully achieved uniformity in its name between American and European markets, began pretty much immediately after the first game's release. Most of the marketing and press releases for the game promised a bigger, more diverse, and more challenging experience, the highlighting of these points in particular clearly drawing upon the main criticisms of the first game by reviewers, being its ephemerality and lack of difficulty. Brian Fleming, a founder of Sucker Punch, who has been credited in every single one of their releases to date, repeatedly broadcast a one-sentence pitch outlining Sly 2 when doing the media rounds, as well as in the making-of bonus video that would feature in the game.
Came up with a one-sentence description that really has guided the development of the product, and the one sentence was, Sly and the gang work together to pull off a string of big heists.
This would serve as the central pretension that the company would hope to achieve with their first ever sequel. If you bisect this pitch, you'll find the two concepts that are the nexus in how Sly 2 diverges from its predecessor, with these being Sly and the gang work together, and string of big heists. In episode 2 of this Sly series retrospective, I'll be examining how the concepts of working together and that of a heist are implemented into the game, and what effect this has on the resulting product when compared to the original. I will also pass the myriad of game modes Sly 2 incorporates alongside the expected stealth platforming action, as well as what attempts have been made to further develop the ever-lovable Cooper gang. Unlike in my previous video, footage this time around has been taken from the Sly collection on PlayStation 3 by Sanzaru Games, and while I don't intend to place too much focus on the HD ports, there will be some brief coverage of this release at the tail end of the video. In the last episode, I discussed some of the cinematic influences that helped shape many aspects of Thievius Raccoonus, such as visual presentation, narrative structure, and Sly as a character. Sly 2 displays a much more focused influence in that the developers have selected a particular subgenre found within the sphere of crime films, with that being the heist movie. Darrell Lee writes in the heist film Stealing with Style that heist films afford a powerful screen identification with criminals breaking the law, and then follows this with a citation from Kristen Thompson's crime films Investigating the Scene, which suggests that crime films provide escapism and voyeurism, or in other words, the pleasure of watching stories about illicit worlds and transgressive individuals. While both of these quotes are attributed to the portrayal of criminality in film, their words are easily transferable to the interactivity of a video game, which is an equally effective form of generating identifiable characters and the irresistible allure of escapist escapades. The heist, or caper film, is characterised by some easily identifiable criterion. The narrative will centre on a group of criminals who cooperate in order to steal a vast amount of money or other valuable commodity. There will often be a focus on the meticulous planning that goes into the heist, with this time also being spent on establishing the various characters. The main appeal of the film will be the spectacle of the heist itself, wherein we witness if the scheme that was devised earlier on is executed successfully or not. Finally will come the aftermath, which is where we learn whether the thieves are ultimately triumphant in their endeavour, or if they face retribution for their transgressions. usually incarceration or death. Despite this well-established subgenre of film that first truly took shape back in 1950, it's not a province that the medium of video games has delved into all that frequently. Heists are usually relegated to a small portion of a larger game, with few exceptions such as the highly popular Payday series, which focuses exclusively on committing a chain of increasingly lucrative robberies. Whereas Sly 1 was painted by the crime genre in the broader strokes, the main realm that least drew upon this influence was the gameplay itself, which retained a strictly video game flavour of being a stealth platformer where you advanced through a procession of levels with the simple goal of getting from A to B to collect an arbitrary key that was keeping you from further progression. Band of Thieves, on the other hand, was forged entirely in the mould of the heist film, so unlike its predecessor, the genre's defining traits are worked into the gameplay itself. Each objective that you must perform in Sly 2 complements the story being told. No longer do levels consist exclusively of gathering keys. You're scouting out new locations and taking pictures so that Bentley can formulate plans. You're setting up communications devices so that you can listen in on the antagonistic Claw Gang's discussions. You're sabotaging hideouts in order to draw out the villains from where they've bunkered themselves. And this list is just a soupçon of the missions you'll be carrying out. The result of this is the game providing you with a far greater sense of actually playing the role of a thief, as your actions have a genuine and tangible effect in aiding you towards achieving your goals. The developers took advantage of the player's preconceived expectations and understandings of what they believe a cinematic heist should look like, to create an instantly familiar experience, despite the reasonable likelihood that most probably haven't played a game of this specific strain before. Taking the established traditions of a particular genus from one art form, film, and transplanting them into a new one, video game, ensures that the users aren't alienated by the apparent newness, as they're able to recognise the patterns from prior experiences, even if those prior experiences were in a totally different configuration. This is Sly 2's greatest accomplishment, taking what we have come to expect from a heist film and giving that format a makeover by way of a game. It's a recognisable story that avoids being derivative because of its originality within the medium. Moreover, this alteration to your objectives allows for the gameplay itself to play a greater role in furthering the narrative, rather than every development needing to be relayed through cutscenes. Take the mission from Episode 1. Bentley intercepts an email from Dimitri, a nightclub owner who's dabbling in currency forging. The email requests that his guards inform him when the coast is clear for him to move to a different location, but for what purpose, we don't know. So as Sly, we use this information to dupe Dimitri by giving the all-clear signal ourselves, and then stalk him whilst remaining undetected. Through doing so, we locate his nightclub's underground aquapump, intel that we utilise later in our planned heist. This gives both us as the player and Sly as a character a more proactive role in the narrative, rather than merely as an avatar whom traverses some platforming stages. Whilst Sly 1 insinuated that you were performing acts such as breaking and entering and dismantling large-scale criminal operations, this was in direct conflict with what you were actually doing, which consisted of little more than running, jumping, and bludgeoning various creatures with your cane. Conversely, Band of Thieves marries story and gameplay where the two entities aren't constantly at odds with one another, which is of benefit to both, as we now have a more varied experience whilst playing the game, which is telling a story with greater nuance in a less jarring fashion, even if the story itself is rather lackluster. The plot of Sly 2 doesn't really differ from the first game, it just takes a different form. Set 2 years after Clockwork's demise, the Claw Gang, another consortium of crime lords, have been gathering the Immortal Bird's components, using them for a variety of heinous benefits, such as narcotics production and mass deforestation. So instead of the pages of the Thieves Raccoonus, this time you're gathering Clockwork's body parts with the goal of destroying them. So while it's essentially the same story being told with a different coat of paint, the improvements all come through its presentation and the more active role you have in the events being depicted. One of the biggest changes to how the game plays, which due to the closer relationship between story and gameplay here also affects the narrative presentation, is in the level design. Sly 1 used the tried and true hub world system, where each area of the game featured a relatively safe zone which accommodated individual instance levels. These have now been abrogated, as each level, or episode, boasts a single large open area for you to roam freely about, and you complete the assigned objectives within this one locale. This does lead to a greater degree of restriction in your choice of which order you wish to tackle each task in, but ends up being a positive overall, as it helps the story remain more focused through not having to deal with the unpredictability of the player's decisions. Shifting the action from a large number of confined spaces to a few vastly bigger expanses allows for a lot of beneficial changes in how the levels are designed. Most of the 8 stages grant the player a variety of ways which they can traverse the landscapes, rather than each destination only being accessible via a single route. Additionally, this gives greater options in regards to stealth, as you now have more places to hide and far more potential angles of attack. The opening Paris stage is a prime example of this, and what I found to be the best designed area in the game. The entire district comprises of 2 levels, the streets and the rooftops. Most of the locations that you're required to go to throughout this episode are on the street level, which also happens to be where the majority of enemies are situated. Utilising the rooftops grants safe passage as you travel to the starting point for each objective, which will then likely force you to perform some sort of action on the tumultuous avenues below, which naturally incurs a greater risk of combat. There is also the matter of manoeuvring through the streets during situations where you're not in control as Sly, but rather as Bentley or Murray, who are now fully playable characters. Obviously, they lack Sly's acrobatic capabilities, so during these portions of the game, a new method of getting to your destination must be concocted, so you can't just figure out the most immediate and safest way for traversing every environment, as you won't always have the same skill set available to you. Curtailing the quantity of locales also means that there is less monotonous clue bottle hunting, mitigating the collectathon style of gameplay that Sly 1 had a scent of, which was already becoming outdated for platformers in 2002, and would have been even less in vogue in 2004. The larger square footage of the maps also come with the side benefit of being able to disperse the clue bottles so that it's actually a challenge to locate them all, rather than having to cluster them together as was necessary before. Unfortunately, Episode's 1 quality level design isn't indicative of what follows, with the layouts for the 8 locations varying wildly in calibre. At the opposing end of the spectrum, we have Episode 3 set in India, with its focus on verticality. The main issue is that unlike Paris, you're often forced upon a set path to get from point to point, regardless of who you're playing as. This takes the choice and incentive to explore away from the player, with this issue being compounded by the fact that to reach a location that may seem close by, the sole path to it starts about as far away as possible, leading to a frustrating and not at all enjoyable trek just to reach a platform that seems within arm's reach. Repetition is another one of Sly 2's big problems, possibly even the biggest. Although there is a far greater variety of mission types and requirements that need to be fulfilled, it isn't long before what amounts to the same levels are repeated across worlds. Even as soon as the second episode, you'll be undertaking missions almost identical to those found within the first, such as the photography reconnaissance levels. Now, some duplication is to be anticipated. I wouldn't expect every single mission across all 8 episodes to be completely different from one another, but the later incarnations of some mission types really don't build upon their earlier counterparts. Many of the objectives can be boiled down to go to X location where Y task will occur automatically, or maybe with the press of the all-powerful circle button. Simplicity is fine, especially in the opening act when players are expected to be more focused on learning the controls and core gameplay mechanics. But deeper into the adventure, I hope to see something more in-depth, which wasn't really the case, and thus the game's general difficulty plateaued fairly early on. By not expanding on the challenges that are established in the first couple of episodes, it makes the latter portions of the game feel like they're just going through the motions, and so will you as a player. You stop thinking or caring about what the game is asking you to do in storyline, and instead just follow the objective markers because that's how you get closer to the end credits. Where the repetition truly damages though is within the individual missions themselves, usually requiring you to perform the same task multiple times successively. You're never simply hacking a single computer or disabling one alarm. It's always do this 4 times in a row because that's what the story arbitrarily demands. This issue mars even the most inventive of level designs. One of my favourites was code capture in episode 4. Here you have to pickpocket keys from security guards, and use those keys to deliberately trigger the alarm on a security terminal, which causes the guard to rush over and investigate. Before they reach the terminal, you must get into a position so that when the guard enters the code that deactivates the alarm, you can take a picture of it. It's a brilliant setup that incorporates a variety of Sly skills in a unique fashion. After getting the first picture though, there's no need for you to be forced to repeat the process 3 more times. It's solely done to pad out the game's length, and due to this artificial expansion being administered throughout the game, Sly 2 takes about twice as long to complete as Thieves Raccoonus. I think that Sucker Punch were too focused on the fact that the first game was frequently critiqued for its short length that they overcompensated in the sequel. But their methodology for doing so ended up hindering the overall enjoyability of the game. Having to dispatch of 5 enemies as Murray is a fairly mindless task, but when you're forced to take out 50, it's just excessive and adds nothing of substance. Furthermore, there's a reason that most caper films tend to revolve around a single heist. They make for an incredibly exciting and tense spectacle, but their impact is severely blunted when overused. In Jules Dassin's 1955 classic Rififi, nothing comes close to being as memorable as the meticulously executed 30-minute heist of a jewellery store, made legendary by the omission of any spoken dialogue or music. But it only accounts for a quarter of the film's runtime. A lot of focus was still placed on introducing the cast to the audience and establishing their differing personalities, and we also witness the aftermath of the robbery and how it led to their inevitable demise. Band of Thieves begins with your breaking into Cairo Museum, and there is never a break in the action henceforth. With the plot consisting of one Megillah heist after another, the usage of high-stakes larceny ceases to excite, and you become acclimatised to what should be an extraordinary event. Only episode 4 breaks away from the mould, where both Sly and Murray have been captured, and you must take control of Bentley in order to free them from immurement. But you're essentially performing a heist, just with the targeted goods being your comrades in place of Clockwork components. This isn't to say that there weren't some standout moments and gameplay enhancements worthy of particular commendation. I do praise the game for restraining itself by not adding too many new abilities to Sly's repertoire, an oft-seen trap for a sequel to fall into purely for the easy marketing of "look how much more our character can do." Instead, our robber raccoon has learnt a few new tricks, each of which have a number of interesting challenges built around them. For instance, you can now crawl, an almost universal skill of stealth games that was oddly not present before. At first, you'll simply be crawling under tables to skirt the view of guards, but this has later escalated into crawling under a moving tank piloted by Bentley, which is providing you the necessary cover to break into the prison where Murray is captive. I also felt that episodes 6 and 7 are the prime example of what Sly 2 has to offer, as they feature all of the game's better qualities and keep the repetition down to a minimum. Both of these areas feature a well-designed landscape that is enjoyable to navigate regardless of which character you're in control of. The wide open spaces of the Canadian tundra allow for plenty of manoeuvrability options, so you always have a clear means of sneaking up on an enemy or fleeing to safety should the situation get out of hand. These areas also contrast most other locations in the game by actually featuring daylight. While obviously less optimal for those in the thievery trade, it does make navigation and finding your way less tiresome thanks to the clearer vision provided. Now that I've covered the heist portion of Fleming's quotes, let's shift to the idea of Sly and the gang working together, and what impact that has. While the trio of Sly, Bentley and Murray were working together in the first game, you really only took on the role of Cooper himself, with Murray being limited to the driving levels and those where you have to protect him, and Bentley became playable for a cup of coffee during a lone hacking segment. So while the story presented the group as working in tandem, everything Bentley and Murray did was solely to assist Sly in his endeavours, with their contributions coming across as more passive due to the lack of direct control you had over them. Sly 2 seeks to remedy this by making the Brainiac Turtle and Staunch Hippo fully playable platforming characters in their own right, both coming equipped with a unique set of skills that will be imperative in completing the game. Murray operates exactly as you'd expect given his size and strength. His ungainliness require missions to severely downplay the covert operations aspect of the game in favour of muscling your way through hordes of enemies and inflicting mass destruction against the Claw Gang's bases of operations. Bentley, on the other hand, has neither Sly's agility nor Murray's brawn, but makes up for these deficits with his loadout of tools, such as crossbow armed with tranquilizer bolts and bombs for finishing off somnambulant adversaries. His objectives are usually focused on infiltrating the IT infrastructure of the Claw Gang, gaining knowledge of their operations, and using this information to construct plans of attack. A suite of gameplay alterations has been introduced to accommodate the addition of Bentley and Murray to field action. Rather than dying in one hit, you now have a health bar, with enemies and destructible scenery frequently relinquishing a restorative icon. This change works with the more open-plan concept of the maps, rather than Sly 1 with its traditional linear platforming levels and checkpoints contained within. Enemies have also bulked up, taking quite a few more hits to be knocked out, which alleviates one of my main complaints with the first game, in that stealth rarely felt necessary as dispatching of grunts was hardly a challenge. This change also emphasises the idiosyncrasies of the three characters. Murray naturally has a far easier time of seeing off swarms of guards, whereas Bentley needs to keep his distance and pick off enemies one at a time with his sleep-inducing ammunition. The removal of one-hit deaths also mean that coins no longer provide a lucky horseshoe power-up after 100 have been collected, instead serving as actual currency with which Bentley can purchase upgrades for all characters from some deep web service called ThiefNet. With most of these being optional pickups, you have the freedom to choose which characters you'd prefer to augment, whether that be who you most enjoy playing as to enhance your entertainment, or to bolster whomever you struggle most with, to make the more frustrating moments of the game a smidge less of a chore. Even with the work put into having two new playable characters, Sly is still by far the most finely tuned and enjoyable to play as. The levels are clearly designed with his furtive moxie in mind first and foremost. Running along thin vines and hopping between rooftops is simply more fun to perform than mashing the attack button or having to repeatedly pull up a crossbow's aiming reticule. This does lead to a bout of Sonic Adventure syndrome, where you'll enjoy playing as Sly, and any time you're forced to change character, you'll want nothing more than to go back to being Sly again. In an interview with GameSpy in 2004, Nate Fox of Sucker Punch was questioned on this very dilemma, with the reporter specifically mentioning Sonic Adventure 2. He responded with, "I think the only way to solve it is to make your other characters not a pain in the arse. Make the other characters really fun. I think that's the only solution." While that may be the solution, it's one that doesn't quite come to fruition here in Sly 2. It's certainly not as egregious as in Sonic Adventure, with no character here coming close to the atrociousness of those Big the Cat levels. Giving expanded roles to the supporting acts of the troupe does provide a better sense of camaraderie amongst the characters, and allows for some development in ways that the first game didn't permit. This should be immediately apparent from the game's title, Band of Thieves. Whereas the first game's title was all about Sly and what his mission was, this time the title highlights that there will be a greater focus on teamwork. In Sly 1, both Bentley and Murray often displayed fear and apprehension, which directly opposed Sly's cocky confidence. By getting their hands dirty and having to surmount obstacles similar to those of Sly, it allows for the pair to overcome their perceived weaknesses. Bentley's able to prove to himself that despite his physical limitations, he can do more than just the technical side of the job. Similarly, Murray is able to conquer his own doubts about his usefulness, and prove that his capabilities, as blunt as they may seem, are just as integral as Bentley's intellect or Sly's cunning. This is best demonstrated in the aforementioned Episode 4, where both Sly and Murray have been arrested and imprisoned. With the call to action falling at Bentley's lap, he must persevere in spite of his corporeal skills. It works so well because we're not just being told or shown this change in his character, but physically enacting out this development by taking control of Bentley and performing the job that he's so plagued with doubt over. Another example of the improved degree of teamwork that the group employ in this game can usually be found in the latter stages of each episode. For the most part, each mission that a character undertakes is performed independently, with little to no assistance from your allies. When it comes to a level's final act though, the big heist itself, everybody has a role to perform, and only through their combined efforts will they succeed. This change is again reflected in the gameplay, where instead of selecting which character you wish to control, the game will provide you with whoever is supposed to be in action at that point in the story. These sections have a much better flow to them, as you're not constantly having to return to your safe house to switch roles. So not only is the transition more seamless, it also feels more cinematic, as the perspective constantly shifts when the narrative demands. I do have a few gripes with the character development though, and this links back to what I said earlier about the repeated heists and lack of downtime in the game. While we do get nice comic book-esque cutscenes that bookend each episode, these are mostly for the purposes of exposition, rather than to give us an insight into the character's state of mind. While a platformer is never going to be the leading genre in well-written characters whose growth is chronicled over multiple games, the more we care about the cast, the more we'll care about what we're making them do in the game. For instance, there still hasn't been a great explanation as to what Bentley and Murray's goals and motivations are for even working with Sly. They're a group of friends who all met in an orphanage, sure, but don't they have any aspirations of their own, rather than helping Sly get what he wants? Once again, if we use the Heist film as a frame of reference, we can see how this problem affects the game. While the heist may be the main draw, it's meaningless without a set of interesting and captivating characters, because we then have no impetus to invest ourselves emotionally in the events we are witnessing, as we don't care about the end result or what happens to the people involved. It's the human stories that makes the genre work. Our engagement with the characters is what creates the drama and tension of the action, and in many ways is more important than the action itself. Godard's Bande à part, released internationally as Band of Outsiders, which may have been the inspiration for Sly 2's title, demonstrates this point very well. The heist itself is incredibly simplistic, mundane even compared to most others. The trio themselves act rather nonchalantly while attempting to rob a house. The reason for this is because the film isn't really concerned with criminality, but instead on the triangular relationship between the central characters and their outlook on life. Tarantino would be heavily inspired by this film, and also take this idea of downplaying the significance of the heist to the extreme in Reservoir Dogs by not showing it at all. But again, the film works so well because of the memorable cast.
Finally, someone comes up with the idea. Wait a minute. While we were planning this caper, all we did was sit around and tell fucking jokes. Got the message?
This is it. Time to break into Iron Horse.
Now, I'm not saying that Sly 2, a stealth platforming video game aimed at a generally younger demographic, should take such avant-garde approaches to its form. But a little extra time spent on relaying Sly and Co.'s thoughts and feelings to us would have given the events that unfold greater impact. The one character I was most disappointed by, though, was Clockwork. And despite the entire plot of the game being that the Claw Gang is gathering his various components, the being that existed within the metallic husk doesn't make any sort of appearance, with the main antagonist ending up being Constable Neela. I mentioned in the previous episode how well I thought the presentation of Clockwork was, and how the lack of information we're provided about his origins created an effective mystique that made him the game's standout creation in many ways. While I would have preferred that he didn't feature at all, leaving him with that mysterious aura, the fact that his body is still present, but his consciousness is not, feels like a tease. I spent the whole game hoping to see Clockwork reborn, and for more about him to be revealed, but instead we got Clockla, whom I had no interest in whatsoever. We need to talk about minigames, or the incorporation of alternate game modes and genres within a specific work. When done well, they can provide a fun distraction that may provide a beneficial reward to those who choose to master them, but those who forego them won't be penalised. When done poorly, you get Sly 2. In the Thieves Raccoonus retrospective, I mentioned how the non-platforming sections of the game were easily the weakest, such as the races, turret sections, and that nonsense with the chickens. Well, they're back once again, and managed to be even worse than previously, despite them accounting for a lower percentage of the overall levels. We have turret sections, remote control helicopters, Simon Says Dancing, tanks, the entire Jean Bisson boss fight, an episode of Robot Wars, and many, many twin-stick shooter hacking levels. Like with the repetitious missions, the inclusion of these mostly feels like a way to elongate the game's length without adding anything of substance. If half of the levels involving these were standard platforming, and the other half were cut entirely, I think the game would have been far better off. The problem isn't just how lazy their implementation feels. Most of them just play very badly. Controlling the helicopter is miserable due to its perpetual movement, and the tank's controls are downright confounding, and every time I come across one of those twin stick levels, it makes me just want to turn the game off and play some Robotron. Comparing these game modes here to their inclusion in the eternally associated Lombax's adventures, there's a clear difference in the developer's approach to utilising them. Hoverboard racing in the original Ratchet & Clank only featured in 2 of the game's worlds, and after that you can enter more races if you wish, or you can get on with the rest of the game. It's up to you. Many games in the series will also feature some sort of puzzle solving element as well, such as the Infiltrator in the second game. Like with the hoverboard, these only halt your progress infrequently, and solving the puzzles takes far less time than any of Sly's turret or twin stick sections. The only one that I enjoyed was the Xevious-inspired 2D shooter levels, because of course I would. Not only are the controls far better than any of the other vehicles, but they actually display some genuine STG-style bullet patterns, and do a far better job of incorporating the shooter genre into a platformer than WayForward managed with Shantae. My final point on the matter concerns boss fights, which to me haven't shown any improvement. I talked about how in Sly 1, the bosses didn't make use of the stealth mechanics that the game provides in favour of just slugging it out, and that remains true here. Boss fights this time around fall into 2 distinct categories: beating up the villain until their health bar is fully depleted, or yet another minigame. Jean Bisson's fight has you playing as Bentley, whilst coordinating with Sly to unleash a series of traps upon him, which, while a neat idea in theory, quickly devolves into just running around a small arena and pressing a button when he mindlessly walks over a trap. Then there's the final boss against Clockwork, which for the most part consists of yet another turret section. The game has put so much effort into creating a varied cast of characters, each with unique skills and a plethora of upgrades you can acquire for them, only for none of that to matter in the final boss, which features neither stealth nor platforming, but instead just aiming and shooting. This should be an opportunity for all the skills you've accumulated to be put to the ultimate test, but instead it makes the effort you've put in feel meaningless. At least the very end of this fight does feature the trio all working as a unit to finish Clockwork off, but the fight is pretty much already over by this point. As stated in my introduction, I'd like to finish off this retrospective by briefly talking about the high-definition ports of this game on PlayStation 3 and Vita. As with this version of the game being what is available on PlayStation now, this is what most people will currently play at the time of this writing. Now, prior to making these videos, I hadn't played a Sly game in over 15 years, so I'm not the ideal candidate to speak on some of the more minute points and differences, and the Sly Cooper wiki has a fairly comprehensive list of changes. What really bothers me though is when content that was present in an older release gets cut. The original PS2 version of Sly 2 allowed you to use a USB headset, whereby if you made a sound into the microphone, nearby guards would be distracted. Furthermore, long-range communication between characters would be played through the headset rather than the television speakers. A neat trick that adds a layer of immersion, but was also no great loss for those without the required hardware. That feature was removed here, despite the fact that with the rise of online multiplayer gaming, far more players were likely to have a headset for their PS3. Even more egregious though was the removal of the 10-minute making of bonus video that I mentioned earlier on. I understand that the majority of people aren't likely to watch this video after completing the game, but I feel that a HD collection for a game series should be the most comprehensive release available, and not abandon content, especially something as informative and interesting as the developers speaking about the game they've worked so hard to create. I still have to say that the Sly Collection is the optimal way to play these games for most people. I didn't have any issues with the gameplay, and while I encountered some bugs, their impact was negligible. But I do feel like Sanzaru did the bare minimum here that was required of them, taking a slipshod approach without any real passion, instead putting their efforts into including some very 2010 gimmicks like 3D and PlayStation Move compatibility. This will probably be my last word on the subject, as I'm sure that I would only be repeating myself if I discuss this topic in the next episode. To conclude, I have very mixed feelings towards Band of Thieves. On the one hand, it technically improves upon the first game in so many ways, from the evolved gameplay style that better puts you actually in the role of a thief enacting out crimes of an extraordinary scale, to the smaller touches like the comic book style onomatopoeia that appears when you knock a guard unconscious. Sly 2 took the strong foundation that the first game laid and built upon it, improving what worked before, but not steering too far off course, and keeping the core aspects of its predecessor intact. Sucker Punch really did a fantastic job of taking a film genre that has seen little representation in games and reshaping it in the form of an interactive experience, which is certainly no easy feat, especially as there are so few prior examples for them to have researched and learned from. On the other hand, I just didn't enjoy playing through Sly 2 as much, which may come down to my own circumstances. While critics rightfully pointed out the first game's short length as one of its weaknesses, for myself, being able to play through a platformer in its entirety in less than 8 hours is ideal, whereas the nearly 15 it took me to complete this game just felt like an absolute chore by the end. All the non-platforming levels of the game is what kills it for me though, but I do have to keep in mind that originally most people had to wait 2 years between the first and second Sly game, so the bad taste of those driving sections would easily dissipate in that time, where it's only been a few months for me, and my tolerance level for them is probably quite a bit lower than it was for fans in 2004. I'm fairly certain that if I had waited 2 years before playing Sly 2, I wouldn't have been so harsh in my criticisms towards that aspect of the game. It did review favourably upon its release, and remains popular with current fans of the series. Perhaps this just wasn't a game destined to be a match with myself, and I'll realign my expectations for Honour Among Thieves. But as it stands, there were simply 1, or 2, or 10 too many hacking levels for my taste. So, if anyone needs me, I'll be playing some Smash TV. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. In the next episode, we look at Sucker Punch's final fling with their pilfering Procyon Day. Until then, please wait warmly.